Good morning, here is KJ7T. It's time for another edition of the Random Wire Reflections, the podcast that expands on some of the topics coming up in the next issue of the Random Wire Review. Issue 101 of the Random Wire Review will publish on Friday, August 2nd. I finally understand why it's called a murder of crows, because as I was trying to record this, a bunch of crows in the background were making all kinds of raucous noise. And, a thought of murdering crows went through my mind. Let's touch on the topics that are planned for issue 101 of the Random Wire Review. The featured content is a piece on climate change and amateur radio. I think you'll find it interesting, maybe a little disturbing, and hopefully informative. The next piece is called Radio Every Day, where I talk about trying to touch something radio every day. Under the topic of tools, I talk about the bookmarking system that I use to gather content during the week to share with you in the podcast and in the newsletter. I also ask, where are the radios with assistive systems? I thought there were quite a bit more resources available to blind hams, for example. On the bench, I'm very excited that I have most of the parts for my AllStarLink node build. I've also received 2 consumer radios for review. And on the microphone front, I'm both unhappy and excited. And then a short piece on the M17 project. So let's get started with this podcast. The featured content is on climate change and amateur radio. While I'm sure the title of this featured content will raise some eyebrows in the amateur radio community, it's an important topic and it does affect many aspects of our amateur radio hobby. This came to mind as I thought about the short report in issue 100 about a group of hams that spoke of amateur radio as having no place in emergency communications. As I was thinking of that, I was also reading that Oregon is the top priority in the country, a dubious distinction at best, for wildfires. Let's take a look at the intersection of changing weather patterns and amateur radio. First, let's not call it climate change. It seems very unfortunate that the term climate change has become a trigger word for many people, causing them to immediately shut down or deny that any changes are happening. The reality is weather patterns are changing. This conclusion is based on evidence gathered from long-term observations of weather. The planet is getting warmer. We are seeing the timing of precipitation events change, and the amount of precipitation received in some regions has also changed. More climate-related energy is driving bigger storms. If you are a farmer or a forester or a wildland firefighter, you probably already recognize that the weather you're seeing in recent years is not like the weather your parents or grandparents experienced. NASA claims, quote, the rate of change is extremely unusual, unquote, when compared to paleoclimate data. NASA also says the rate of change since the mid-20th century is unprecedented over millennia. As a geologist, I know climate changes. The geologic record is full of examples of huge shifts in our climate. It's happened before. While we like to think of the planet as a big inert ball, a geologist sees it as a huge dynamic system that has one constant. It is always in a state of change. Unfortunately, it's hard to find evidence on the internet without that information being linked to some conclusion that recent changes are due to human factors. Sadly, when one mixes evidence and conclusions, sometimes those conclusions become misleading or downright upsetting. The evidence says weather patterns are changing, and that should be enough to capture our attention. It seems like hubris to think that a single species on the planet can prevent changes in weather. At the end of the day, I care more about identifying what we might do to perpetuate the human race, and less about who or what is responsible for those changes in weather patterns. Our primary job is to figure out how to adapt and survive. If we also find ways to slow or stop changes, well, that's just icing on the cake. Call it climate change if you wish. I will continue to think of this as changing weather patterns, because calling it climate change interferes with having rational, reasonable conversations. Changing weather is creating more damage. This topic becomes more interesting when it involves what we do for a living or what we do for enjoyment. The intersection with amateur radio is this. Our amateur radio hobby is affected by weather in several ways, some large and some small. If weather is getting worse, it will affect us at some point. For example, big storms affect telecommunications. Last year, CBC News in Canada reported that the post-tropical storm named Fiona, quote, affected electrical grids and telecommunication networks, leaving some people unable to call for help, unquote. Are such storms related to climate change? According to NASA, tropical storms have been getting stronger over the past 40 years. That strengthening is attributed to climate change. Quote, the warmer the water, the stronger and the more energy this system is going to have, and it's going to just increase in intensity. So are hurricanes getting stronger? The answer to that will be yes. We are seeing more and more tropical cyclones become Category 3, 4, and 5. So in reality, yes, we're seeing that change every season in the last several years. Unquote. I think my two important points in this are, number one, tropical storms are getting bigger and lasting longer, and number two, big storms affect telecommunications. When those telecommunications networks go down, who are you going to call? Amateur radio operators. That's who. We also know wildfire can damage critical infrastructure. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, identifies wildfire impacts to critical infrastructure. Quote, wildfires can disrupt critical infrastructure sectors such as transportation, communications, power and gas services, and water supply. They also lead to a deterioration of the air quality and loss of property, crops, resources, animals, and people, unquote. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, says wildfire is affected by changing climate conditions. And I quote, climate change, including increased heat, extended drought, and a thirsty atmosphere, has been a key driver in increasing the risk and extent of wildfires in the western United States during the last 2 decades. Wildfires require the alignment of a number of factors, including temperature, humidity, and the lack of moisture in fuels such as trees, shrubs, grasses, and forest debris. All these factors have strong direct or indirect ties to climate variability and climate change, unquote. Amateur radio has a role in assisting emergency management and facilitating communications in emergencies. In the realm of emergency management, effective communication is paramount. When traditional communication infrastructure fails due to natural disasters, technological malfunctions, or other unforeseen events, amateur radio operators, often known as hams, play a crucial role in maintaining lines of communication. We need to be ready for anything. With wildfires burning sooner and hotter and more unpredictably, with floods sometimes impacting our communications infrastructure as well, it's important to be prepared for anything. This applies to amateur radio operators also in a wildfire situation. When an emergency occurs and conventional communication channels fail, hams can take immediate action and use ham radio to assist in emergency communication work. So, does weather affect radio signals? Says a company called Barrett Communications, quote, the method by which HF radio signals are broadcasted means that they can be susceptible to breaks in contact, including excessive rainfall. Raindrops essentially absorb the radio waves being transmitted, impacting clarity. Furthermore, storming conditions such as thunder and lightning creates radio noise and static that makes messages difficult to interpret, unquote. Changing weather certainly affects individual amateur stations. More rain or heavier rainfall, moisture can find its way into connections in your antenna and feed line. This kind of situation can affect high-frequency signals, but probably has more impact on VHF and UHF frequencies. If you're a ham that plays in even higher frequencies, you already know how critical your antenna system is. Sometimes you can hear thunderstorms on high frequency, or HF, from the other side of the country. Rainfall can increase background noise and static. Water droplets can scatter and absorb radio waves, particularly above HF, VHF, and UHF frequencies. In my own experience on the HF bands, this can make it very hard to convey information quickly and accurately. Now, some will want to argue this point, and I concede that rain, in and of itself, is not likely to be significant at HF, VHF, and UHF frequencies. More directly, we all know to disconnect our gear when lightning threatens. One lightning strike nearby can destroy thousands of dollars worth of equipment. The ARRL recognizes this risk and publishes links to numerous articles about lightning protection and electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. Heavy cloud cover may reduce signal strength. Wildfire smoke may interfere with communications. This may be partly dependent upon the amount of water vapor in the smoke. In fact, fire itself may attenuate signals, particularly in the 400 to 450 MHz range of frequencies. I postulate that cell phone users may see even more attenuation of signals because of the higher frequency used by cellular networks. This content is not intended to be an exhaustive dissertation on changing weather and how it may affect amateur radio. It should suffice to say that if weather patterns result in more extreme weather events, it will affect how radio waves travel. That means it will affect what we do in our amateur radio hobby. Whether we wish to admit it or not, weather does intersect with our radio capabilities and enjoyment. Does radio have a place in a world experiencing changing weather patterns? Absolutely yes. It's reasonable to conclude that despite the existence of modern, high-speed networks on land, in the atmosphere, and even in space, there will always be a need for a reliable backstop consisting of functioning amateur radio stations and skilled and willing amateur radio operators. I'd like to close this featured content on a fairly positive note. In an article on eos.org titled "Ham Radio Forms a Planet-Sized Space Weather Sensor Network," the authors make a case for the utility of new technologies in amateur radio. And I quote, and it is a long quote, "Ham radio is currently experiencing a technical renaissance thanks to the advent of inexpensive single-board computing platforms, i.e. a complete computer built onto a single circuit board, such as a Raspberry Pi, and open-source software. Such computer-based systems serve as virtual radio repeaters, connecting computers via the internet to actual ham radios in the real world to enable remote control and data collection. Beyond the old-fashioned pursuit of voice communication, the lure of maker movement projects and the removal of the Morse code requirement from the amateur licensing exam have led to a greater number of licensed amateurs than ever before. Out of this increasing technical sophistication, digital communications networks, such as the Automatic Packet Reporting System, or APRS, the Weak Signal Propagation Reporter, or WSPR, and the Reverse Beacon Network, or RBN, enjoy wide membership and serve the amateur community while collecting propagation data at rates and resolutions that were previously impossible." Unquote. As I wrote this piece, I wondered if my frequent defense of radioless protocols and systems still made sense. I think it does, but like all things, such methods work best in combination with other systems. In other words, digital data and voice probably don't have legs without radio-based communications. Given the explosion of digital modes and hardware, the reverse corollary is probably true as well, i.e., radio-based communications are likely to continue to see digital technologies employed alongside or as supplements to traditional radio. You might say that digital and analog systems have become symbiotic in the sense that the success of one depends on the success of the other. Such is the nature of growth and change. Next is radio every day. I don't think I've shared my daily radio habits with you. I try to touch something radio every day. For me, this is an important practice because my life is busy, and sometimes it can be easy to set aside or even forget about for a time my amateur radio hobby. I don't want to lose momentum or stop learning something new every day. I regularly listen in on several radio nets. For example, I listen in to the 9 a.m. net on AllStarLink node 2462. This is a regular morning net hosted by the Puget Sound Repeater Group. This reaches me via my AllStar node 588412 with great audio through an old Heathkit speaker, or my Sherry node 588417 and a Yaesu FTM-300DR handy talkie. Sometimes, like this morning, I listen in via my node 588411 with audio coming through the speakerphone in my Cisco SPA 525G phone. That audio is always pleasantly clear. While I'm driving to get my morning coffee, I like to listen in on the W7RAT repeater, the Rat, in Portland. This is an IRLP repeater that regularly hosts the worldwide friendship net. This signal comes to me via analog FM radio. Also on my coffee runs, I listen in to the America's Kansas City-wide network that is repeated by the WA7BND repeater in Portland. That signal is digital C4 FM, very clear. At home, I often listen in via Wires X through my FTM-300DR portable digital node. I also like to listen to the Alaska Morning Net on ASL node 29332. And finally, I love to check in with friends on the W7NEE repeater in Shelton, Washington. This Yaesu System Fusion repeater is owned and operated by a ham radio friend, Jeff W7NEE, in coordination with the very active Colorado Digital Group. The W7NEE repeater is the default in my home-built hotspot that I use only for Yaesu System Fusion, and Jeff also provides an ASL node that is great to listen to. As I pause and reflect on what I just wrote, I'm realizing how truly lucky I am to have so many great technologies available to me. Most of this equipment is affordable, and the audio quality over digital can be excellent. Just as important to me is how this technology democratizes, as in the action of making something accessible to everyone, ham radio. If we think back to the time before digital radio, one often needed a fairly complicated, large setup for worldwide high-frequency communications. Today, through digital data and voice modes, worldwide communications cost a fraction of a high-frequency plus antenna station. We might always have some disagreement about whether digital modes represent real radio or not. Offsetting this concern is this fact: digital modes make accessing the world relatively easy and affordable. While some of us may want to put up a tall mast and a big antenna to work other stations over high frequency, some of us aren't able to do that for various reasons. Digital radio levels the field for many amateurs. Let's move on to some tools. One of the tools I use is a bookmark system to capture interesting content. I had meetings most of the week, and yet still managed to dig into a variety of topics and bring them forward in issue 101 of the Random Wire Review. I peruse hundreds of news sources each week and capture interesting items using an app called Pocket. Originally, this was a free browser extension called Read It Later, which I used extensively. Later, that morphed into the Pocket app I use today. The free version is perfectly adequate for most users, I think. I capture so many links, though, that I pay for the premium service. There are alternatives to Pocket available. For example, I use raindrop.io to capture bookmarks to share with the Conservation District community I serve. You can see that list at a link provided in issue 101. Raindrop works well. Each bookmarked item has one or more tags, and when you click on a tag, you get all of the bookmarks that are identically tagged. Next, I ask, where are the radios with assistive systems? I'd like to touch on assistive technologies for hams with challenges. In issue 101, I refer you to handyham.org and another link that's too long to read here. Truth be told, I was mighty surprised to find so few good resources for hams who need assistance to enjoy amateur radio. One thing they can do is enable voice prompts on a Yaesu FTM-300DR by installing a Yaesu FVS-2 plug-in module. The FVS module is a voice guide unit for the FTM 100, 200, 350, and 400 series radios, and some vendors claim it will work with the FTM-300. One person who regularly serves as net control on one of the nets I listen to is a blind ham who uses the FTM-300DR very effectively. For those of us who are not sight challenged, it may be hard to imagine the many barriers a blind ham faces. So imagine, is your antenna connected? Is the power on? What's the SWR? How's my tuning? How about operating memories in a radio? How do you diagnose a problem in the local station setup? If you'd like to learn more about radios that work well for blind hams, I provide a short list of resources and also a couple of groups. By the way, this kind of assistive technology is not limited to only amateur radios. For example, Sangean makes an AM/FM table radio with voice prompts. If you or a family member need this kind of assistance, an amateur radio or an AM/FM table radio with voice prompts can be a gift that demonstrates your understanding and caring. And finally, I get to talk about what's on the bench. I'm really excited about this AllStarLink node build that I'm working on. The bits and pieces I need to build an audio interface for an AllStarLink node are coming together. I have a Kenwood phone patch controller PC1A box that will form the container for the audio interface. 2 modified CM108 USB fobs recently arrived from a UK vendor. However, I'm not particularly fond of how the modifications look, so I'm going to try an alternative. That alternative is a kind of custom-made RL-20 RL20 audio board from Master Communications. It's on the way. I asked the vendor if I could purchase a board without the DB9 soldered to it, and he said, sure, no problem. The RL20 is also coming with the red and yellow LEDs reversed, which I will need for a radioless node. I have a spare Kenwood MC60 desk microphone I can use. I also have a genuine Alinco DTMF hand microphone I've already tested on my node number 588412. In my shack bins, I have numerous small audio amplifier boards, capacitors, switches, and more. I may look for a rocker switch that will fit into the on-off switch location on the phone patch controller front panel. Clearly, I'm having a lot of fun thinking about this and preparing to complete the build. I also received 2 consumer radios for review. Recently, XH Data sent me 2 radios. The D608WB is a portable AM/FM shortwave and weather band receiver that can be charged with a hand crank or via the solar panel built into the top of the device. It also charges over USB-C. The D220 is an AM/FM and shortwave pocket radio that is not yet listed on the XH Data website at the time of this review. I received these radios at no cost to me with the expectation I would review them. I'm not very familiar with XH Data, so this will be an interesting exploration of these products. My first impressions are positive. The D608WB radio uses an 18650 lithium-ion battery for power. I've been listening to that radio for 2 days while it ran in the background off the battery. I've split that time between listening to local FM stations and listening to some of my favorite albums stored on a micro SD card. I doubt I'll get the full review done by the time issue 101 is published, but I've started that work and look forward to finishing it. The other radio, called the D220 radio, is an AM/FM and shortwave receiver. It's pocket-sized and evokes memories of those pocket transistor radios some of us had in the 1970s. The speaker looks bigger on the D220 than on the D608WB, but the 608 speaker has a base port on the back side of the radio housing. Unlike the 608, the 220 uses AA batteries. I've spent less time with it while I work with the 608 unit. I will include a couple of photos in issue 101 so you can see what I'm talking about, and maybe that will tease the final review when I get that done. I'm unhappy about some SIM cards. The FreedomLink LTE radios I bought in May have not had much use. Several weeks ago, I was notified by the vendor that some of their SIM cards had been compromised. I was urged by the vendor to immediately stop using the two radios. They sent out new SIM cards, but those cards never arrived. About a week ago, I contacted the vendor again to inquire about new SIM cards, and they tell me a replacement shipment is on its way, and I may have more to report by the time issue 101 publishes. Let's talk about microphones again. I'm both unhappy and excited. The small Shure brand microphone I purchased has been a bit of a disappointment. Yes, it looks like a Shure microphone, and for that I am grateful. However, for $100, I expected a microphone that had a bit more metal instead of so much plastic. I'm not certain I like the sound either. I need to do more testing. On the flip side of this coin, I ran across the Behringer C1 condenser microphone. Reviews paint a very rosy picture of this XLR-only mic. I also stumbled over a Behringer Tube Ultra Gain Mic 500 USB, that's MIC 500 USB, audiophile vacuum tube preamplifier with preamp modeling technology and USB/audio interface. Wow. The C1 mic is about $50, and the Mic 500 USB preamp is about $124. Following up on those glowing reviews, I checked eBay on a whim and found a Behringer C1 mic and the Mic 500 USB device as a package listed for $80 as an open box item. I purchased that package, and I'm really looking forward to using the mic and preamp. I want to talk for a moment about the M17 project. Being a longtime supporter of open source software, I find I'm very, very curious about the M17 project. M17 bills itself as, quote, open source amateur radio. However, I haven't carved out much time for M17. Instead, I've been following Steve Stroh's coverage of M17 in his great Zero Retries newsletter. Steve finds some of the most interesting amateur radio content for his newsletter, and I always look forward to going through it from top to bottom. Zero Retries is Random Wire recommended. Finally, in errata, I have a correction to issue. In issue 100, I said HAMSCI stood for Ham Science. Nope, that was incorrect. HAMSCI is an abbreviation for Ham Radio Science Citizen Investigation. This, and I quote, is a collective that unites amateur radio operators with the research community in the space and atmospheric sciences. I apologize to HAMSCI for mislabeling them in issue 100. And with that, I think it's time to close this podcast. I did have a very busy week last week, and the coming week looks just as busy. Thank you again for subscribing and for taking the time to listen to the podcast and to read the Random Wire. 73 to all. I hope you have a great week, and you can catch the written Random Wire review, issue number 101, this coming Friday. This is KJ7T, and I'm clear. And now for some outtakes. I struggled with this particular recording today. First, let's not call it climate change. So the question becomes, is amateur radio still useful in the... This featured content is not intended to be an exhaustive... Also on my coffee runs, I listen in to the... Most of this equipment is affordable, and the I regularly... My first impressions are positive. My first... I doubt I'll get the fuel... I doubt I'll get the fuel review. I doubt... Reviews paint a review... Instead, I've been following Steve Stroh's coverage of M17 in his great Zero Retries news. I had a very busy week last week, and with my 50th class reunion coming up next week, it's going to be a very... And that's it. Thank you for listening.